The absolute worst thing you can do when you're designing anything, the absolute worst thing you can do is set out to design something which is automatically and also ran. And that is the trouble for this class. That is a trouble for this class. The Slavas. Honestly, this is a class which, when you start to cover and start to talk about, you can very easily end up talking in a lot of very vague terminology. Because, on one hand, you have the whole description of them as these wonderful, powerful cruisers. On the other hand, you have the fact that they slow churn them out. They're basically the insurance policy for the Kirovs. They aren't used to do the mass cruiser presence role of that is done by the Crestas and the Kinders and the Sverdlovs. The Cresta ones never really do that, and as mentioned in the Carav class video, they don't really get called upon to do that either. The Slavas, what can we say about them? They're the insurance. Look, there's a lot of, at the moment I'm going to use this phraseology because who knows, maybe YouTube has vaguely linguistic things in its algorithm, and they will hear it and go, oh, we've right up. There is the whole heir and a spare theory when you get to monarchy. Doesn't work quite like that, but yeah, you always have to have more than one child, because what happens if something happens to your only child? Then you know something without an heir, and a solo heir is a very precarious position to be in if you're a monarch. It's also very, very precarious for your heir. This is the converse thing of history, as is shown, and a monarch with just one heir can have a lot of problems, especially if anything happens to that heir. But people are all thinking, well, if something does happen to that heir, while growing up children, it's quite a dangerous life, especially in the older periods, then you have a problem. Then you suddenly don't look stable. So that's why you want more than one heir. You want more than one child. Conversely, then when you're a monarch, having all those siblings means there's lots of people who have quite a good claim to the throne. And if you give them even half a chance, if they don't like you, you could suddenly find yourself having people coming for you. It's the converseness. Whilst you're the heir, multiple siblings actually helps you. Once you're the monarch, multiple siblings hinder you. Well, when you're building ships, it helps to have a clearly defined role. It helps to be able to differentiate them. And again, that's the trouble. The spare is a defined role, but it's not really a clearly defined role, because what does the spare do? The heir has a role. They're in training to become the monarch next. There's the monarch. That's a clearly defined role. The spare, basically they're sitting around a heartbeat away from having a heartbeat that matters. It's kind of like if you are, I don't know, the third in line in the chain of succession to become prime minister if there are issues, or president if there are issues. People always care about who's next in line, because that's the potential, but they don't think much about the number 3. They really don't. They should probably, because if you're successful enough to take out number 1, probably you're going to be able to take out number 2. And no, Secret Service or anyone who's watching this, MI5, whoever, I'm not planning on doing it. Mainly because, can you imagine the paperwork? Seriously. But Gorshkov, the Soviet Union as a whole doesn't really have that sense of approach. They don't. They have a very different scenario where they do not want to be in any scenario where they have egg on their faces. And if you're producing a nuclear-powered capital ship, you've also got to produce something as backup just in case it fails. Meet the Slava Class. They're not the high-status capital ship. They're not the multi-purpose task group cruiser. They are not the global presence ship, because they're not. That's not how they're deployed. Because, again, the trouble is with sending one of these around is everyone looks at the other thing you've got back home and goes, but ain't your biggest, is it? And also, then you have to do a lot more support to get one of these around the world. Their weapon systems are a mixture of what was available off the shelf. They don't get anything innovative or new, but there again, this is the Soviet system, so getting innovative or new systems is kind of rare anyway in terms of entering into a class. They do look like someone has taken a Kara class and added in a few decks to the superstructure. Honestly, they do. It also, let's put it this way, we talk about the Queen's Anne mansions on the King George V's and HMS Warspite, etc. after they've been upgraded in the run-up to World War II. Look at that! That puts a Queen's Anne mansion to shame! Oh, it really does. But no. What were these ships for? Well, broadly speaking, as said, they're the spare. And they're the spare who has a very slow production. Moskva laid down 1976, launched 1979. Marshal Osnov laid down 1978, launched 1982. So 3 years, 4 years. Varag, 1979 to launched 1983, another 4 years. Ukraine, 1983, launched 1990 after 7 years. And the commissioning, what? That takes 6 years for Moskva. Again, nothing shows you are a spare more than when you start to compare their time in terms of completion to what was actually a far bigger, far more powerful, nuclear-powered, complicated project. Because, if we go with those again. Moskva, 1976, commissioned 1982. Ushkov, i.e. Kirov herself, laid down 1974, commissioned 1980. So, you have 6 years to build a nuclear-powered battle cruiser, which is going to displace, let's be honest, 24,300 tons standard, 28,000 tons full load, and is nuclear-powered, remember. Or 6 years to build something which is 9,380 tons of standard, that's 11,490 tons full load, and is gas-powered, and uses the same gas engine system you've just used on a previous class, and uses pretty much all the same weapons as you've used on a previous class. Barring one system. But even that's not really new for them. That's more being built for other things. And, well, you know, it's available. It looks good. It looks powerful. It fits. Moskva, commissioned 1982. And then Usnov. Well, that's commissioned in 1986. 2 years after Lazarev. i.e. Frunz, is commissioned. And Nakhimov, commissioned 88. That's the third of the, that's Kalin, the third of the Kirov class. Farag, commissioned 1989. Yuri Andropov, aka Peter Veliky, the current one which scares the bejesus out of most people, laid down 1986, so laid down after Ukraine. Launched 1989, so launched the year before Ukraine. Commissioned 1998. Now, it could be that the yard that is building the nuclear ships is just super more efficient and far better. But considering how this yard got through to Kara class, I do not consider that to be the case, and other ships they were doing at the time. So, in simple terms, this is your go slow, backup, air, spare to the air scenario. It's there to fill in if the Kirov project fails. And the trouble is, once you've built one and you find the Kirovs do work, you then have to decide, well, hang on, do we cancel it? And there are those people going around. And of course, Gorshkov does fall in 1985. So that's after 2 Kirovs have been commissioned. And 1 of this class has been commissioned. The project which actually gets stopped, if we can think about it, again, this is one of my points about Gorshkov when people say, oh, he falls and completely they cancel all the major projects. The project which actually gets cancelled is Despair, not the nuclear battle cruiser. They build that! But the trouble is, these ships still have a status. They still have this sort of thing that they are these big ships. They're these flagships. Especially once you start decommissioning other the nuclear battle cruisers. And you only have 1 aircraft carrier, and suddenly these ships find themselves in a role which they're really not prepared for, and they haven't been maintained for. Because they've been the spares. That's what they are. They are larger than the other cruisers, and this is usually when I get into this discussion with people look at me and go, but they can't be because they're bigger, they're this, and you go, but they're the spares. Because what is their individual role that is not covered by a dozen other ships? And yes, the Soviet system is horrendously overcompensating, but what is their role that they do that isn't done by a dozen other ships? Usually better. And I know this video is probably going to get attention from a lot of people watching because of the events in Ukraine recently, where one of them got sunk. And I know, according to Russian news sources, it was a storm which managed to set off its magazine and make it blow up or something. The various things change, and then, of course, there's quite possibility of Ukrainian action, and that's usually a bilge pumps discussion. But I will say this, I don't think either of those stories go well for Russia, because if a storm is proving rough enough in the Black Sea, which is not the roughest place you go and work, so if you, nicest way, if you've designed a ship and actually had got a ship in service, no matter its age, which gets so upset by a storm in the Black Sea that its system goes off, then please never let any of your ships out in the North Atlantic. Okay? That's just not a good one. Okay? That's not good. So there are other stories. There are about a dozen different potential stories out there of how this thing happened. But honestly, I was less surprised than most, because despite the naming, the heraldry, the imagery, this was the Spare. It, just like the Heir, is the one which receives all the training and all the tutelage in politics and gets all the sort of the finest stuff. The Spare usually just gets whatever's left of time. And this class gets whatever's left in terms of availability of engineers, of weapon systems, of everything. And so even if you upgrade them, you're upgrading from that point. And nothing says this more, that this is a spare, than the P500 Basalt. I know, technically they get the P1000 Vulcan eventually. But how do I put this politely? This is the same system that's been fitted to the Kiev class carriers, so yeah, it's really good. But what's being fitted to the Kirovs at this time? Oh, so that's the P700 Granite. And when I say I wouldn't want to be actively on a ship which was hit by either of them, honestly, neither of these missiles would actually make my day to be hit by. I could think of far better things to be than being on a ship hit by them. If I had to pick between a missile which was given by NATO the reporting name Sandbox, or a missile given the reporting name Shipwreck, I think I know which one if I had to choose, if I was given that option and those were my only options, not a third option of not getting hit by either, I'd probably go for the Sandbox. Which, well, interesting speed. Maximum speed Mach 3 plus, so it's the faster of the two actually. The Granite is Mach 2.5 plus at high altitude, Mach 1.6 at low altitude. But still, it's a 4.8 ton or 10,600 pound missile versus a 7 ton or 15,400 pound missile. And you can make some very sensible options for why this is chosen, but again, this is part of it being a spare. They're going for the proven, off the shelf, it's available, let's stick it on. It looks like it's capable, but it's not really the all singing, all dancing new sexy, is it? It's capable, but it's not. What is this shit? You know, you can sit there and look at them and go, why? There's almost a good argument, the Slavas, of going, why not? Are these the Kara 2s, which have been adjusted to take this missile? You can make that case, but then you'd be asking yourself, why are you adjusting the design to take a missile which isn't that much of an improvement over the previous missile you've already got in service on the Karas, and all the extra expense and difficulty when you could have just built a Kara? And you can then point to the missiles at the back, of course, the air defense missiles, as you can see on Moskva here. You can go, well, no, it carries these as well, so that gives it air defense capabilities. Yes, but they already started fitting those to Kara class hulls. As of. Yeah, to test the system out, but they fitted it to Azov. So, again. And it comes back to, you needed a spare. You had no clear role for it. One of the other things I often see with these ships is they go, well, Soviet task groups were going to operate in far smaller numbers of ships. Each task group was going to be smaller, so they needed more command ships. Agreed. I do agree with that. But again, these ships don't make up the difference. You're still going to see task groups which are going to be led by perhaps the Kara class, possibly a Cresta. Those all have command facilities as well fitted into. In fact, the whole reason the Soviets have quite so many cruisers is because that provides them with quite a lot of ships with command facilities. That's part of the reason for building the cruisers in the first place. So you're just building more ships. You're building an insurance, and when it turns out you don't need it, you keep it going. Admittedly, yes, as mentioned, this is the program which, of the surface ships, of the major surface combatants, probably suffers most from Gorshkov's fall. But also, this is probably the surface program which I would say is most likely to have been being ignored by Gorshkov in the first place. And his successor. Because what was it? You can't claim it's the prestige vessel, because that's quite obviously the Kirovs and the carrier program. It's not the mass numbers vessels. That's what the Udaloys, the Sovremes, and all the other destroyers are that are coming through are. It's not even the most populous cruiser. That probably is a debate between the Kara class and, well, the Kara class, honestly. Cresta 2s. But the Cresta 2s aren't really as popular as the Karas. So, here are these ships, which are being armed with not a bad system, but not the newest, best system you have available. They're being armed with what's available off the shelf. They're off-the-shelf spare cruiser design that you're building just in case your nuclear cruiser program fails. Turns out to be a lemon. And what I find funny is with the Soviet Union and the way it's obsessed with politics, political image and everything else, even if they had turned out to be a lemon, they wouldn't have stopped building them, because that would have mean they would have to admit that they were building a lemon. And that's the last thing they're going to do. Hey. You always know your industry is in trouble when you start going to certain other nations for a reliable car. And then you don't pick actually the reliable car version of it. You don't. But leaving that to one side. The S300, the SA-10 Grumble, again with the bracket missing, but I thought I'd leave it because I'd done already one video of it missing and I didn't feel like restoring it. These ships have an interesting time. And again, this system specifically is supposed to give them this capability as an anti-aircraft vessel. It's the S-300. It's a really capable missile system, theoretically, as long as it's maintained, as long as it's upgraded. And technically, they have the S-300F. Now, the F variant. Oof. Well, the F-300F is... It's not much of an improvement, but it is an improvement over the ones which were initially fitted in the Azov. Well, not the... yes, the ones fitted in the Azov. It's better. But it's not a lot better. And it's mainly capable of being fitted because they do take so long to actually enter service. I.e., they enter service in 1982. So they definitely get the V5 V55R. And eventually, or quite quickly, the 5V55KD. I think that's it. I worry about some of the translations from Clarke to... Oh, good lord, brain. To Latin alphabet. I was going to call it the Greco alphabet, and I knew that was wrong. This is the trouble with my brain. But those systems, they're fine for their period. But again, they're not carrying an absolute oodle of them. They are only equipped with 64. They carry a total of 104 surface-to-air missiles. So yeah, they're not a massive enhancement air defense-wise. The Clarke class had actually carried 120 surface-to-air missiles in there between SAN-3 and Gecko system. And yes, when they had the SAN-6 fitted, the Grumble, the Azov went down to 24, but that's because she really wasn't designed around the system. She had her magazines designed around the Goblet system, and suddenly she gets the Grumble. They upgrade. They don't really upgrade either both positions as well. That well. It's a fun upgrade program for the Azov. We'll leave it to one side. No. And then we go with the naming of this class. We have the Marshal Ustinov here. Well, she was called originally Admiral Flotar Lobov. Moskva was the Slava. The Varag was the Shavona Ukrainia. And of course, the Ukrainia would be the ex-consulates and the Admiral Flotar Lobov, because apparently people really wanted to name something after Admiral Flotar Lobov. And frankly, Semyon Lobov is... He served in the Soviet Navy 1932 to 1977. He'd commanded cruisers after World War II. Between 1938 and 46, he commanded escort ship and destroyers. He took part in the Soviet war against Japan in 1945. He'd served in the Soviet Pacific Fleet. He was a deputy in the Supreme Soviet and a deputy chief of staff in 1972 of the Soviet Navy. One of many deputies Gorshkov had over the years, who all proved singly... well, he managed to get rid of them. They always got up to the second position and then they found they weren't getting anywhere further. But, of course, he was a fleet admiral, which was a very senior post. If you consider admirals of the fleet of the Soviet Union, only included Kuznetsov, Iskov, and Gorshkov. Fleet admirals, Kasanov, Lobov, Sergeyevich, Yergovich, Smirnov, Shenovin, Sorokin, Kapitolets, and Makarov. So, he's got senior, but really? You're going to name a ship after him? And even Marshal Ustinov, let's be honest, is not really the sort of name which you would associate with, wow, Dmitry Fyodorovich Ustinov was far more of a politician than a marshal of the Soviet Union. He served 1941 to 1984. He spends a large chunk of his time as Minister of Defense. He is very much going for political officers. Very much political officers. So, again, Not the greatest names. Not the greatest choices. But Marshal Ustinov has still a fairly interesting career as these ships go. As they go, she has a fairly interesting career. She spends quite a lot of her time wandering around the Mediterranean. That seems to be where she's quite popular to pop up. She also has visited in the United States in 1991. Again, a good use for the ship. She paid a visit to Canada along with the destroyer, the Slava Class Admiral Kalamov. And basically, she spent her time wandering around doing command duties. This class came in and actually turned out to be far more useful than they'd probably been planned on being because of the fall of the Soviet Union and a need to cut costs. And it's far cheaper to operate one of these as your flagship while claiming not to lose status, rather than a carrier or a nuclear-powered battlecruiser. This vessel has spent a lot of time in the Mediterranean, in the Pacific, and in the Barents Sea. In fact, when she's in the Barents Sea, sometimes she decides to play alongside Peter Veliky and works alongside her. But really, her career has been a very, very quiet one. Shuttling backwards and forwards, doing all sorts of operations, but mainly ones which are political presence ones. If you look at her time in service pre the fall of the Soviet Union, she really doesn't get to do much. She sort of, between 1982 and 1986, when she's renamed, which is of course still going through construction, she's waiting to be commissioned, and in 1987, when she starts operation with the fleets, she just poodles about. Which sounds terrible to say and like I'm doing this shit down, but I'm not. She's noted when she turns up. And the fact is that selling 2 Sovereign class destroyers to China in 1996 was theoretically funded the repairs to the Marshal Ustinov after she'd had issues. Basically, how to put this, she goes and visits Canada, and she then, when she gets home, needs to be repaired and maintained and refitted. And it takes a year to refit her. And this refit is made possible by the sale of those 2 destroyers. Not sure if it wouldn't be more sensible for the Russians to keep the 2 destroyers. But leaving that to one side, they have the Marshal Ustinov. And again, she has Ossa. Now, by the way, some of my comments on this from the previous video, talking about it, many people come back going, oh no, it's closer to Sea Sparrow than Seawolf. Let me clarify. I don't think it's really like any of them. I think the thing is, it's to an extent is a point defense system. And so if you're talking to a British audience, and I can understand why the people then would say, oh, it's the Soviet equivalent to sort of that period of Seawolf, because that's the point defense missile we understand. A British audience is most likely can understand for a period from the period. And if you were talking to an American audience, you'd probably say Sea Sparrow because. But honestly, I would say, yeah, I wouldn't put it in the class of either of them, especially not the original versions, especially not the versions which are fitted in the 70s, 80s. No, there has been work on it, and let me put it this way: I would still prefer not to be in an aircraft having it hunting me down, but I would say the level of precision and lethality of Seawolf and Sea Sparrow is greater than that system achieved in its original forms. And I would argue that it's still probably, how do I put this? Seawolf and Sea Sparrow aren't necessarily as great as we perceive them to be. Seawolf gets, because of the Falklands War, a lot of positive coverage. So Seawolf is not necessarily as good as its image is. But if you even then, if you take a look at the reality of Seawolf versus its image, the reality of the Gecko, the Ossa, not as good. And there are reasons for this, because again, the Soviets' decision-making process when it comes to development and their wider technological development process, again, as I got into and discussed in the 1965 to 1991 Part 3 of the Soviet Navy series, there are issues with procurement and development in a communist system. There are differences than you would experience in a Western system. There are good points, bad points to this. And then we have the Varag. The Varag... Oh... She's not always been a lucky ship, I think is the best thing we can describe her as. She has spent most of her life with the Pacific Fleet, and she is the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. Just like other ships have their service, I would say Varag has been more than useful to Russia and the Soviet Union before it. Far more useful than it was probably thought it was going to be, because again, it was a spare. It has been critical to Russian presence in the Far East. And probably thanks to that, does seem to have been kept in fairly decent condition. Fairly decent condition. However, she's not always had the best luck. But what I would say is that she is also the vessel which was called back by the Russians in 2015 to take over from Moscow in supporting operations in Syria, because she had been upgraded, because she was considered capable. But and I'm saying but a lot in the case of Varro, because she does do a lot of the political. She's actually turned out to be probably the most cruisery of the three ships in terms of her deployments and operations and active diplomacy and presence missions, and She postures off the coast of Australia with a task group and all these things. It's it's the full-on ship. But it's also kind of the trouble with using the spare as such. The trouble with making use of the spare in this way is it kind of shows you're not able to do it with the crown jewels. This is the other problem with building the spare. It makes sense, but then when you use it, if you use it rather than sending the nuclear powered battlecruiser or an aircraft carrier, it makes you, the person who you're deterring or you're trying to influence, wonder where they are. Now, if they're off being used elsewhere to intimidate other people, you then feel suitably chastised. But deterrence is a strange and mercurial thing, in that if they're sitting at home and have been in refit for many years, it looks like you're using the spare because you don't have anything else you can use. And if that's the case, it starts to make you look a little bit, how do I put this politely, weaker. It makes you look more hollow. It starts to, instead of, it turns a position of strength, we're turning up this mighty task group. Listen to us. To, well, we're turning up with a task group of ships we can actually make work. They're powerful. They're the ones we can make work. Again, this is the problem with deterrence. Okay, this is the deterrence is and presence are so wrapped up in image. It's a concept which you almost have to keep explaining because it can seem so counter to what people who study the field and study naval warfare and study these sort of ships, etc., would think, because they look at the real stats and they see the ship and the stats almost flash in front of their eyes and they're going, yes, that's that. But that's not who you're talking to, and that's not who the message of these ships is about when they're turning up as deterrents. They're turning up because they're the image. But then if someone who is an expert turns around on the news, etc., and says, and of course these ships have been deployed because their bigger vessels are all in refit and aren't able to be, currently have moved in the last few years. And then everyone starts looking and going, which can almost push it the other way. It looks like, I don't know, you look like those those older samurai in Japanese culture in a sort of the 1920s, etc., when for the big occasions they would hire a servant for the day. They couldn't normally afford one, but for the day they'd hire a servant, and so that they could live up to the status of their position. I'm using this story because I've just been reading the book about this. And it was very embarrassing when they forgot their servant's name. So part of the condition was the servant would answer to whatever name they were called. Which could get very interesting. Could get very, very interesting. And then we have Ukraine. Number 4 of the class. Ukrainian government actually at one point did consider finishing this vessel in order to sell it off to the highest bidder. As they weren't going to get any money from it otherwise. The fact is, Ukraine probably could have done it. They had enough of the defense industry left over there because of the Soviet Union, the way it had been structured. They could have more than likely have completed the ship and sold it off. The question is, who would have bought it? Well, we know who'd have probably bought it. Let's be honest. The same nation which bought a former Soviet carrier from Ukraine and all sorts of other things. It would have been China. Did China want it? That's the interesting thing. China didn't. And so Ukraine decided there was no virtue in doing it. And I would argue the reason China didn't want it is because, again, it's the spare syndrome. Yeah, why would we want that? We want one of the first-rate stuff. We don't want the thing they just put that stuff in. It's never been commissioned, never been used. It's another casualty of the Cold War. A different casualty than we probably think about. But it is a very real casualty of the Cold War. And currently, I can imagine both sides in the current war, which is raging, wouldn't have minded having it. And so we get to the summary point, and I get to talk about Moskva, because I've so far held off about this. Moskva originally called Slava. Now, as said, there are many versions of how she sinks. There's the fire causing munitions explosions sinking in stormy seas. There's the stormy seas caused problems in the munitions, which led to her sinking. There is the... Honestly, there have been many different versions put out. All we can be fairly certain of is she sunk. And... honestly, I'd say the best for the Russians would actually be, for their image, is actually that she gets sunk by the other side, because some of the other stories coming around make their navy look laughable. Especially the Storm one. The munitions fire and then the Storm, that's possibly the most other logical option versus a Ukrainian strike. And you have to remember there is propaganda on and counter-propaganda on both sides. But what do we know about this ship? We know that she hasn't been maintained as well as she should be. We have heard enough stories and had enough evidence corresponding. And there's been enough examples of it happening before that it actually does have a fairly solid ring of truth to it, that her upgrades and the process and systems which she was supposed to have achieved hadn't been actually done, and people had diverted those funds for other, more personal experiences. We like to believe the end of war idea, the wars aren't going to happen anymore, only affects the West. It doesn't. There are other nations it has infected and who think, well, there's never going to be a war, it's never going to happen, so what harms it if I take this? What harm is it? Be very careful, because that kind of thing infects far more. It's just in the West it tends to be kind of obvious because the politicians do it openly. But honestly, the Russian fleet in the Black Sea is proving the point which Gorshkov and all others knew about them from the point in the Cold War, that in the modern age of air power, etc., the Black Sea, which is quite literally ringed with air bases, you either need to be able to put out an all-powerful task group that can maneuver around the Black Sea, or you need to not have your surface ships there. If you have your surface ships in port, or if your surface ships just keep into developing a habit, this is what, to my mind, lends credence to the idea of the Ukrainian attack. If your ships keep developing a habit of going up and down in the same area, they are kind of going to get themselves in trouble. They become predictable. Wars are disturbing like that. And a ship which hasn't been kept up to standards, which was built as a spare in the first place rather than the air or the capability, it's going to require more effort to bring that up to standard, because it's probably not going to be fitted with the finest equipment at the get-go to begin with. So you don't have the normal cushion. If you consider us, if you build a ship with the very latest of equipment you have, the very best, you probably have an extra 5 years of utility before that equipment is not useful anymore. Versus if you use it with stuff which is good but off the shelf as it's already available. In terms of as long as that equipment is maintained. Now, saying that, there is also the problem which seems to affect quite a lot of Soviet ships and ship designs, and of course now the modern Russian Navy, because they don't seem to have managed to overcome it. And that is the same problem which affected the Royal Navy in the Falklands War, and caused the Royal Navy to lose ships in the Falklands War. That if you're on the comms talking to home, your radar doesn't always work. Now, it might be you turn off your radar in a specific section. I think that's kind of what the Soviets planned after the Falklands War experience. Rather than having to turn off the radar entirely, they could try and focus it away from those sections. But if you then get in a habit of transmitting at the same time every day for a few days, kind of make it predictable which section you might not be covering with your radar. Honestly, my own belief is that it will be a long time after the war is over that someone will be able to get into all the relevant archives and try and piece together what actually happened to the Moskva. It's going to be a long time. I think it's also it's one of those things. When a ship gets lost, you lose not only a ship, but a crew loses a home. A lot of the crew tend to get lost as well. And it's just generally a bad scenario. The biggest problem for the Russians is that they can't bring in reinforcements. And honestly, I would say of the fleets, the Pacific Fleet has suffered since the end of the Cold War. Varag at times has been pretty much the only available vessel which seems to be in anywhere kind of serviceable condition to go and do things, which is why it does things so often. Other ships have been kept going and are available, but it seems to be Varag has been their primus vessel. Ships in the Northern Fleet and the Baltic, well, let's be honest, they have other issues. The Northern Fleet, especially the money that's being looked at for the Arctic, tends to get funding from that, which can help them muddle along. The Baltic, well, they have St. Petersburg and all the events which happen there every year, which means there's always a certain level of funding going for it. The Black Sea, well, that was always kind of regarded as the Russian backyard. And this is another problem. Because it means that if you're thinking about funding and you're prioritizing funding, you have an area where you can get resources which are critical to your economy. You have an area where your politicians and all your grandees will line up and look at your ships. You have an area which you don't spend much money on anyway, and mainly what you are spending there you're selling to someone else. And you have an area which you pretty much believe you are the overwhelming power in. And honestly, it's very difficult to argue you aren't. Where do you put your money? The Black Sea ends up number 4, doesn't it? It ends up getting the pinky funding. Pacific Fleet, St. Petersburg, the Baltic, and the Northern Fleet. By the way, that's naval aviation, is the fun. This means to me, looking at especially the deployments of the Pacific Fleet, deployments of the other vessels, the Black Sea Fleet has taken part in operations. They have been critical for Syria and all those sort of things and doing those roles. But again, the more and more you look at those roles, the more and more you see the ships are basically being used as shuttles, as visibility, as presence, not actually doing much with their systems. And not getting the same level of training, perhaps, even as the Pacific Fleet. The list of, when you start looking through them and the open source information available, the list of exercises which the Varag has taken part in and has been part of is colossal. It's a massive list of things. And the Moskva, which is this theoretically high status, also flagship of the Black Sea Fleet, also this sort of flagship vessel, it just doesn't seem to have had quite the same experience, according to the open source intelligence, according to the stuff which is publicly available. Yes, she's taken part in some things, and she did get the new Vulcan, the upgraded P1000s, in April 2001. If we go back to this little diagram I have here, well, the Vulcan is an improvement. It is an improvement. And the upgraded versions are an improvement. But again, one of the interesting things I find is that whilst it is reported that the Moskva was fitted with them, we only really know for certain that Varag got them. Which, as said, has in some ways been being a one-ship navy in the Pacific Fleet. So, Moskva. It's too soon to tell what happened, really, and be conclusive in a historical way. On bilge pumps, you'll have heard my instinct, and that's the scenario where we discuss, where me, Drakenfell, and Jamie Seedall discuss what we think might have happened to things. where we act as a check on each other in a way and make sure none of us get too wrapped up with a narrative in our heads. But, saying that, these ships have suffered. They really have. The fall of the Soviet Union caused all sorts of disruption. The Soviet Union itself was not that great when it came to infrastructure and maintenance. It really wasn't. You know, sometimes it's talked as if it's a new thing of our senior officers misdirecting funds for their own personal benefit, but directing funds off to build daishas and comfortable dwellings, it's nothing new. The Soviet Union, it was almost a standing joke that the local party officials would be corrupt, that some of the officers would be corrupt. The senior officers, some of them actually actually developed their operations and plans based on some of their officers being corrupt, with the idea that if they factored it into their program development, then their program was more likely to do better than if they pretended it didn't exist. And again, we know this because of the actual accounts and some of the biographies of those officers, the written memoirs of some of those people. And occasionally, yes, it's reading a bit between the lines because they're sort of vague about it, but it's there. It's not so vague that you are making things up. That doesn't quite add up if you're presuming everyone is playing the game cricket. But if you think someone is not playing cricket, someone's trying to play rounders in the middle of your cricket match, okay. But they were pretty for spare ships. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you're going to enjoy Warrior tomorrow. And it's the Ottoman-Venetian War on Saturday. And then it's Heir on Sunday. So I hope you're going to enjoy it all. I am going to try and make sure everything works as it's supposed to do. I'm trying to make sure I have basically recorded all of everything up till Tuesday this week. So you will probably see a lot of this t-shirt or other t-shirts from this week and this date calendar next week. I hope you will enjoy. You enjoyed the series on the Soviet cruisers and the Russian cruisers as they are now. Honestly, when I planned the year of the cruiser back in 2021, I had no idea what was going to happen. So, please, now, if you're going to start commenting that I am doing this for ratings or because of the 10,000 subscriber wager going on between my mother and my aunt, I'm not. This was planned a long, long time ago. And honestly, I almost didn't do this class. And I adjusted the way I did this, approach this class, because of what had happened. Because I didn't want to look like I was trying to make things after the death of a crew. It's not good. War is forever a risky business, and as I've said on more videos than I care to think about, and as I say more often to people than they probably care to remember, it has more luck in it. More luck than modern humanity would care to think. Because modern humanity is precocious. It's arrogant. It believes it can predict things. It can do things to a mathematical certainty. probabilities and all these things will factor in for them. And that's lovely. But the reality is, the world is not so nice and neat. Thank you for watching. I'm going to finish the question is that the Slavas are not the only spares in terms of ships built in history. And I'm wondering if you know, if off the top of your head you can think of any other classes which were spares, classes or pseudo classes as this one is, because they are built again in such a staggered fashion that each one's actually slightly kind of different from the others. So it's kind of a class as in we're going to group them together, they're all going to have a broadly similar shaped hull. The stuff inside them though is going to be quite different because they're going to be so spread out. Like the Kirovs. Thank you very much for watching. I'll look forward to reading what you think are spare classes which were spares, and take care. Have a nice evening, and hope to see you on Friday for the live, which will probably be a long one, because let's be honest, I am going to be trying, and please note I am using the phrase trying, to cover 73 years in probably 4 hours. Fun times. Fun times indeed. Thank you.